Good morning. I'm Barbara Mel Goldman, Sun City Grand, Channel 22, and I have the privilege of being able to talk to Bill Peter, a futurist and consultant. I've spoken with him before. By this time we're old friends, and he has a lot of input on our futures. Bill is a futurist, and he is a Sun City Grand resident for 7 years, I believe it is. And Bill, good morning, welcome, and it's so nice to see you here today. You're going to be speaking today on the future of the United Nations, is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you, Bill. Bill, as a futurist, what is your view of the future of the United Nations?
Well, a futurist looks for what might happen in the future and what we could make happen in the future. And you have to take a little bit of look at the past in order to be able to project the likely future. I was born in New York City, and the United Nations was formed in 1945 when I was 10. And in 1950, I went to the United Nations building at age 15. And so I saw the brand new, sparkling United Nations building, and I was fascinated by its hope for world peace. And I remember reading books. I remember reading Dag Hammarskjöld was one of the early Secretary Generals, and I thought he was like the king of the world to be the head of the United Nations. So I have been watching the United Nations as an enterprise, and unfortunately, the United Nations has a whole lot of problems. And there are some people who think that when you say United Nations, you should say it reverently. And it's not really so reverent. There's so many loopholes in its charter and so many problems with its operation that we really should ask, is it right to have the United Nations? Should it be changed? Should it be fixed? How can we do a better job?
Do you feel that it's possible for the United Nations to be reformed and improved, Bill?
Well, it's 60 years old, and it hasn't had major reform in 60 years. When you have an operation that hasn't changed its basic philosophy in 60 years, it can get bureaucratic, it can be out of control. We've seen some good things that the United Nations does. The United Nations does some wonderful humanitarian things. When it comes to controlling peace, it is completely ineffective. And that was its original charter.
Well, do you feel that if the United Nations has lasted for 60 years, will it be around for the next 60?
I'll take a little sidestep and explain this to you. The final answer is I don't think it'll be around for the next 60.
Could you tell us why?
And I'll tell you why I come to that conclusion. When the United Nations was formed after the Second World War, one of the pivotal issues was how does it get managed? So they decided that there would be a Security Council and there would be 5 veto powers on the Security Council. And so those 5 people, the United States and Great Britain and France and China and Russia. At that time it was the Soviet Union. Okay? So those 5 have veto power, and when you form any organization, who is the boss, who can make the decisions, who can veto the rights of everybody else is important. So here was an organization built with 5 vetoes, and that meant any one of those 5 could cancel what the Security Council said. That's a defective system for building an organization, but look, it was after the war and we had to figure out some way to come together. They looked originally to what happened with the League of Nations. The League of Nations happened after the First World War. And after the First World War, Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, was very strong in saying, here are the 14 points and we will have a League of Nations. And countries signed on, but not the United States. Woodrow Wilson was not able to convince the people of the United States to sign on to the League of Nations. And that was a slap in the face to Woodrow Wilson, obviously. And the League of Nations went on with its office in Europe, and the United States was not a member. In the mid-30s, before the Second World War started, Japan and Germany, two of the leading aggressors in the Second World War, resigned from the League of Nations. Interesting, you know, when you're going to go to war, you don't want to have some international body telling you not to do it, so you resign from that international body, and that's what Japan and Germany did.
They did that in the mid-30s?
35, 37, and they decided the League of Nations was crimping their style. And so that's some of the history of the League of Nations. So then we went through the Second World War, and in 1945 we formed the United Nations. Rockefeller gave land in Manhattan Island for the building, and then in 1950 it was built. But when you have 5 vetoes, it's a problem. Now, if you look at it today, the 3 largest economies in the world are the United States and Japan and Germany. Japan and Germany lost the Second World War, so they weren't given any veto power. 60 years have gone by, and Japan and Germany don't have the veto power. Now that's a problem. You say, well, you know, we ought to give them veto. Well, then try to run an organization with 7 vetoes. But think about it from a Japan standpoint. Russia, which has a veto power, is paying approximately 5% of the bills of the United Nations. Japan, which does not have the veto power, is paying approximately 15% of the bills of the United Nations. If you were Japanese, you might say, that's taxation without representation.
Absolutely.
I'm paying 3 times as much as Russia, and they've got the veto. So when you ask the question, can it be reformed? In order to reform it, somebody who is in power has to agree to the changes. Do you think that Russia will give up its veto power instead to Japan? You know, so there are structural things in the United Nations that are a problem. Now, there are other things besides structure. There's lots of bureaucracy. There's lots of, well, the oil for food situation in Iraq, where Saddam was bribing people and bribing countries that, you know, just let us have oil for food and the money will go to the humanitarian good of the Iraqi people. Well, that didn't happen. Saddam was building mosques and castles, and the people didn't benefit, but there were lots of people benefiting in France and Russia. And France and Russia said to Iraq, we got you covered. You can run that through the United Nations because we've got the veto power in the United Nations. Mm-hmm. So is it possible to reform? Probably not.
Well, if you were to design a perfect international organization, what might it look like, Bill?
That's a challenge, of course, and it's easy to sit in a chair and say what it would look like, but I'll give you some ideas. There are 6.5 billion people on Earth. So if I were to design what comes after the United Nations, because I think the United Nations is going to have a very difficult, if not impossible, time rejuvenating itself, I would say I would make a list, and I've actually done this. I'd make a list of the 15 largest economies in the world. Which countries are the 15 largest economies? And then I'd make a list of which countries have the largest population in the world. So I took a list of 15 largest economies, 15 largest populations. Because after all, the United Nations should represent the largest number of people in the world, therefore the largest populations. And we have to have some money to take care of the responsibilities, so we need some of the countries that have the money to pay the bills. So we need those. So I made this list of the 15 largest economies and the 15 largest populations. And lo and behold, I said, wouldn't it be interesting if I was creating the United Nations from scratch?
Okay. What would be the most constructive international posture for the United States and the United Nations?
Well, first of all, I would take a look at these 15 largest countries and economies. And I'd say, which countries exist on both lists?
Okay.
That they are not only large in the economy, but they're also large in population. And as it turns out, and this is a little bit of a surprise to people, there are 7 countries. So if I were to say the 7 countries exist that are very large in population and economy, those might be very important countries. And these are the 7.
That's what
These are the 7.
Here.
You wonder who those 7 are.
Yes.
And there are a few surprises, and I'll explain it when I finish. In North America, there are 2. 2 of the top 7 are the United States and Mexico. Mexico is one of the top 15 populations and one of the top 15 economies. And people are surprised that Mexico is one of... So out of the final 7, U.S. and Mexico make 2 of those 7. In South America, there's only one country that is on both lists, and that's Brazil. You don't hear about Brazil having veto power. You don't hear about Brazil, but they're one of the top 7 in population and economy. In Europe, there's only one country that meets that criteria, and that's Germany. In Africa, there are no countries that meet that criteria of being large populations and large economies. In Asia, there are 3. Japan, China, and India. So now we've got 7 countries, Japan, China, and India from Asia, Germany from Europe, Brazil from South America, and Mexico and the United States. And if I were to build a new United Nations, I'd say, I have to get those 7 powers, and between them, those 7 represent, like 70% of the world's population and 70% of the world's economy. Mm-hmm. I better have them on board. If I'm going to cover the population and the economy, I better have them on board. Those are the 7 powers. But as I told you before, Japan is not being treated as well as Russia, And notice, those 7 that I mentioned does not include France, does not include Russia, does not include Great Britain. Can you imagine convincing Russia, France, and Great Britain, sorry, you're not one of the top 7? Pretty tough. Pretty tough to do that, and yet that's what the United Nations dilemma is. How do you get a world body to be representative of the population and so on? And we have to recognize that 60 years have gone by, and Germany and Japan have gotten huge economies as well as populations, and are not giving recognition for it in the United Nations. That says the world is going on, but the United Nations is standing still. You have to change something when you do that. And
have they wanted veto power?
Everybody that has that veto power loves it.
But they haven't instigated getting it at all? Japan and Germany?
You can't. Because the powers that be means you have to change the charter of the United Nations. Mm-hmm. It's like changing the U.S. Constitution.
Yes,
see?
Yes.
You have to change the charter, which was written in 1945. And Japan has been very vociferous in saying, hey, look, we pay 3 times as much as Russia in the bills. Mm-hmm. Somewhere along the line, somebody is going to say, I'm not going to pay the bills anymore unless you give me the power. Mm-hmm. But even though I've found out which of the 7 countries that I would worry most about, I still would not create it with 7 veto powers. There's a better way to organize than 7. Suppose it's a majority vote, so you have to get at least 4 out of those 7, you know, something like that. But veto power is very, very dangerous. We've lived through a conflict between the free people of the world and communism. You know, so it was the Soviet Union and China, you know, had communism and we were free, and so that was called the Cold War. In the United Nations, there are 135 nations, I think the number is 135, that call themselves the non-aligned nations, because they would be appealed to by the communistic countries and appealed by the West, and they said, we want to not be aligned because we'd like to get trade with both parties and we would like to get money from both parties, so we want to be non-aligned. The Soviet Union dissolved, and now it's just Russia. The Soviet Union dissolved approximately 1990. The German wall went down in 1989, so approximately 1990. And to this day, from 1990 to 2007, those 135 nations are still voting in the General Assembly as the non-aligned nations. There's nothing to align with because there is no more Soviet Union. And they're still voting as the non-aligned nations. They're stuck in the mud from the past, don't know how to change, and it's because not only of the veto power, but non-aligned nations. They're bureaucrats doing what bureaucrats do, the same thing that they did before. Getting change in that environment is very difficult. So somebody's got to lead change. And I think the only way to lead change is if the United States leads it.
And why do you think it will be up to the United States? Is there no other nation that could do that?
Well, can you tell me which one you think would? Changing the United Nations.
I would have thought Japan and Germany would have.
Okay, but they don't have the power to influence
They don't have
this.
the power.
They don't have the
How could they gain that?
They would have to call a constitutional Congress, so to speak, a rewriting of the charter, right?
Do you see that in the future, a
No.
rewriting of the charter?
I don't see how they could rewrite the charter because the United Kingdom and France and Russia would be afraid they're going to end up not getting power in the new system. So, gee, why should I rewrite the charter so that
They'd have nothing to gain.
the entrenched people tend to keep it that way? So I've asked myself, how would you align a worldwide organization that could be more effective? You know, I think it would probably have to be a country with an organization without vetoes, with no vetoes.
Such as?
No, you just have to form a new thing that says it's a majority vote of the top 7 or that kind of thing.
I see.
And the admission to this United Nations would only be countries that have democracies and a free enterprise system. Wow. That means no dictatorships, you know?
Yeah.
No dictatorships. All the dictatorships in the world would say, we want to be members. Well, change yourself to a democracy and a free enterprise system, and then you can become members. But right now, what we have is dictators trying to tell other countries what's good. The United Nations turns out to be, right now, if you're honest with the reading of the news, and you know what's going on in the United Nations is a place where you bash the United States and you bash Israel. That seems like the purpose of the United Nations. There's a commissions that are for make sure that the Human Rights Commission. The Human Rights Commission is formed, and they had Libya as head of the Human Rights Commission, you know, who doesn't believe in human rights. And they had the people who they have ahead of these human rights commissions have no interest in the objective. So what did every resolution out of the Human Rights Commission for 20 years come out? Anti-American, anti-Israel. That's the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations. It is a opportunity to have public discussions in multiple languages and bash who you want to bash, and it's popular right now to bash Israel and the United States. Is that an organization you want to become part of? Well, we are part of it. So what do we do?
Yeah.
So that's the question. What do you do about it if they... And I've been involved in business situations where we've had industry associations, so that, like there's all the car manufacturers have an industry association. All of the clothing manufacturers have an industry association, so on. And that's good. They see what the latest trends are and so on. I have seen companies that have left the industry association because it was conflicting with their personal business. Mm-hmm. The industry association was trying to tell them what they had to do as a personal business. Well, in the free enterprise system, you can do what you want, and if you don't like the industry association, you don't give money to it, you don't go to their meetings, and then you operate your own business. I saw wonderful examples of that, and that's the way you have to do if you don't like what an organization does. First you ask, can I reform it? I don't think it's possible. Other people might be able to. I don't think it's possible. And then if you don't reform it, then create a new one, or meanwhile, get out.
Get out.
Now, I have done a little analysis, and this is a little shocking, but somebody asked me, 50 years from now, what will the United Nations be like? What would you do? 50 years, give us plenty of time.
Yep.
It's been in operation for 60 years. So what are you going to do 50 years from now? And this is my point of view. The United Nations is there as a peacekeeping organization. It does humanitarian things. But of course, when they try to do peacekeeping, they have a problem. They wear blue hats, and the rules are nobody's supposed to shoot anybody that has a blue hat on it because they're peacekeepers. Mm-hmm. But the tyrants of the world don't much care about a blue helmet. And they'll shoot at whoever they want to shoot at. And so when the blue helmets of the United Nations troops start getting shot at, the United Nations pulls the troops out. So the United Nations is not empowered to provide troops when you really need troops that know how to shoot and are willing to shoot back. So therefore, when a situation comes up like Kosovo, that Milosevic is doing a lot of damage there from Serbia and Kosovo, and we called it ethnic cleansing, the United Nations could not find a way to have a United Nations sponsored military force to take care of Milosevic. So what we had to do is we had to go to NATO. And NATO has military. We provide, other countries provide, and it was the NATO forces that went and took care of the Kosovo problem. The United Nations doesn't know how to handle military situations because they don't want their blue troops, the blue helmet troops, to ever have to shoot back. Well, when you have problems, you have to have people that are willing to shoot back, and that's a problem. So 50 years from now, I think we're going to have to take the leadership as the United States. It'll take a while before we get the thinking power, the strategic plans, but it probably should recognize that the United Nations housed in New York City is a bad thing. In fact, their building in New York City has a lot of structural problems where asbestos.
Yeah.
They have a lot of asbestos problems. It's an old building. It was built in 19...
And that's dangerous.
It's dangerous.
Yes.
So they want to remodel it. Mm-hmm. So they said, okay, well, we'll get a contractor to design a new plan. So they designed a new plan. 4 years after the architect got the contract for $40 million, So the architect has $40 million and 4 years, and they asked for the plan. Yeah, it's reasonable after 4 years and $40 million. They asked for the plan.
Absolutely.
They picked an Italian architect, and he says, can't do it. $40 million, can't do it. They asked for the copy of the architectural drawings on how they were going to get rid of the asbestos and all this. Their plan was to build a whole new United Nations, strip this one, and then move all the people from the whole new United Nations into this one after it was rebuilt. Well, it was a very bad plan, but they didn't have any drawings. So they fired the architect $40 million later, 4 years later, and they have no plans.
And they're out $40 million.
They're out $40 million, and that's the effectiveness of the administration, not counting oil for food and so on. So 2057, what we have to do is get rid of the bureaucracy, and this will sound shocking, but I believe what the United Nations should do, what the United States should do, is say, we, the United States, effective December 31st, 2008, we're announcing it now, but December 31st, 2008, we resigned from the United Nations. And effective December 31st, 2008, you must move away from that location that you have now outside of New York City. So you have time to go figure out where in the world you're going to put your United Nations if you want one, but we're not part of it. Now, if somebody wants to form a new thing that is democracies that are free enterprise, and that's what they want to have, we'll join that, but we're not going to stay with something that we know can't be reformed and we know is just a place that people want to bash us, so we just back out. And then the question is, what is the United States' role in the world? And this is provocative. I think we need to say we are 5% of the population of the world. 5%. And what we think we should do is make sure that we help the world in humanitarian ways. And if somebody wants to become democracies and free enterprise systems, we'll send a team of 100 people to consult with you. But we're not going to send troops all over the place. And we are not any longer going to be the policeman for the world. We, the United States, don't want to be the policeman for the world. We shouldn't be the policeman for the world. And we're going to start off by saying, in the next 5 years, a bill has to be put in Congress to do this. In the next 5 years, 50% of all of our troops that are outside the United States should be brought back to U.S. bases. And then we will have said, we have a different posture in the world. We've brought 50% of all the troops that are dispersed around the world back to the United States. We have offered to do humanitarian things, and we will help in tsunamis and that, but we are not going to be part of the United Nations.
Bill, what you've just said is very, very thought-provoking. I know my audience is going to hang on to every word and examine what you've said. If all of that could come true, we would be in a different place, and it would be a wonderful world. You've given me so much to think about, and it's just been astounding listening to you. I know you're very good at what you do. Bill, I want to thank you so much. You are a wonderful resident here in Sun City Grand. We're lucky to have you. For myself, I'm Barbara Mel Goldman with Channel 22. And you've been speaking to Bill Peter, a futurist and consultant. Thank you so much, Bill. And it's a wrap.